So welcome to the last, it's not really a talk, last panel of the day on day 2 of UGM 2021. Our esteemed panelists are here collected. We've got Nirav Merchant from Cyverse, University of Arizona. He's gonna play the role of moderator today. We've got Pete Clapham from Wellcome Sanger Institute, who's our keynote speaker yesterday. And then our iRODS Consortium Executive Director, Jason Coposky. They're going to talk about storage chargeback, policy and pricing. Originally came out of a question around S3 and bring your own bucket, but it's a bigger question than that. So take it away, Nirav.
Well, thank you, Terrell, and thank you, Pete and Jason, for agreeing to be on this panel on a topic that I feel is really critical, and many of us that run, whether it's a small iROD system or a large one, are dealing with large amounts of data and the need to grow and stay up to date over time. And to do that, there's a lot more planning in terms of capacity, whether it's equipment refresh or it is keeping people up to date in terms of the capability or training the users. So there's a lot that goes into this. And often when we talk of a deployment of iRODS, many of the places put heavy emphasis on the storage infrastructure and how to maximize it, which sort of is the strength of iRODS and support the diversity of users. But with growth comes many other challenges. And so what I was hoping as part of this panel conversation, hear from Pete, and his group runs some of the largest ones. And similarly, Jason has spoken to so many facilities and groups over the years that there's a lot of insights into how each of us are able to continue doing what we are doing and still stay afloat. So sharing some of these little secrets or nuggets of information from our collective experience. And then what I hope is we open this to the audience and get questions, but also creative insights from the group that's here, because I'm sure we can learn from each other. And the last thing I'll say is there's a lot that's happening, especially in the US, from our funding agencies, which is sort of NSF and NIH and others. NSF and NIH are both promoting a lot of the commercial cloud credits that come with what we have through our regularly funding mechanisms. And so when we offer those credits to our end users, they have no idea how to leverage maybe an S3 bucket, because there's a lot that goes with it. And having a layer of iRODS in front of it makes it fairly easy for us to exploit those credits in a much more meaningful manner. And likewise, a lot of our campuses are investing in, we heard this morning in Ceph and other capabilities that to take them to the next level, a layer of iRODS becomes really helpful. So taking all of these topics, maybe I'll start first with Pete and then Jason and hear their thoughts, and then we can open it up for the audience.
Sure, thank you. So I think at the core of it is, how do we assign value and cost to the services we provide? We're looking at it as a service level rather than just as blocks of storage. And the approach we've taken, because we're going through this exercise now, as you might imagine, we're looking at hybrid cloud solutions, how we engage better with third-party cloud providers, as well as our own on-prem private cloud and HPC. How do we cost things in an effective manner? The approach we've taken, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but the approach we've taken at the moment has been to try and work out how much the service has a total cost of ownership over 5 years might be. So we would look at the storage element, obviously how much it costs CapEx to buy it, what we believe in terms of the software, the maintenance, the overhead supports, the installation costs, but also how many full-time employees do we need to run that service. And that gives us a service cost for that reclaiming our costs spent in terms of time and effort. And that seems to be working okay. When you move to cloud and you start looking at, say, external S3, because we've got our own internal S3, when you start looking at cloud, there's an assumption that suddenly you have a reduced set of costs. People forget that you still need the sysadmins to make it link together and to work. And actually the time doesn't necessarily go down, it may go up. Because whilst you may not have the same time to invest in creating the service, you can often reuse the service you've got and extend it. But suddenly you're hit by bandwidth questions, egress, data charges. Where am I allowed to put my data? What are the controls and regulations on it? Who owns the data when I put it in this particular location, locality, on this particular service? What extra tax charges might I face? A hot topic at the moment, I think, in the world of big cloud providers. And I think actually what we're looking at the moment is a similar approach for what would that impact be to our service cost? If I would say have an S3 component, what would that add in terms of the overheads for our team to run it, to ensure that the bandwidth is there, to ensure that we don't hit delays or service impacts? And what does it mean when we're not in control of the service? Because if S3 goes down somewhere else, what are we going to do about it compared to what if it was in our hands? It doesn't make the service better or worse, it's just different. The escalation paths are different, the points of contact are different, and it's a different procurement financial model. So coming up with a common set of numbers is the hard part, I think. And I think the TCO cost that we're trying to work out for the service is possibly the most effective route we've taken so far. But I'm very interested to hear if there's a better way of doing it.
So Pete, just a quick point of clarification. When you run your systems, do you apportion the costs to individual projects and then individuals within sort of your organization as cost centers, or how is the structure for you in terms of apportioning the investment made in this area?
That's actually another hot topic internally. Up until recently, where you might get a grant application, people need to cost their grant application. And we make available the costs associated with each of the services that people may wish to use. And they can work out quite easily how many bytes per base they need in terms of the genetic sequence. Imaging is going to be challenging because we don't have as much history with microscopy work. So that's going to take a bit longer to develop. But we've come up with the average numbers to store a piece of genetic material. Therefore, if you've got a project that's 20,000 samples, therefore you're going to need roughly this amount of storage, which on this particular platform will equate to this total cost of ownership, which will include the running of the service, the management, the maintenance. So we get a reclaim of costs at the end of it that's equivalent to what it's actually cost us over the lifetime of the infrastructure. So that's what we've been doing. Obviously, when we start dealing with third-party clouds, people start getting used to the idea of what's my cost per hour? How do you manage this per hour? Well, I only want to leave it there for 3 days. I don't want to make the 5-year investment. And that's a developing model, and it's something that we're working on at the moment. Obviously, we can produce those cost per hour numbers internally, but how do you make it relevant? Because of course you've got an internal upfront cost. How do you model a system, say, for example, that may never be more than 80% capacity, but quite often spend its life maybe part capacity, maybe full capacity use? How much contingency do you need to add to that cost? And I think that's a hot topic that we'll be delving into ourselves over the next couple of years. It's not an easy model to make. Monte Carlo only gets you so far.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, Jason, you're back. Let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this always proves to be, you know, an interesting topic, especially when we start mixing in things like quotas and, you know, bring your own data, as Terrell mentioned before. But I always have to ask the question, so, you know, we're not just storing data in S3, we have Scratch, we've got, you know, on-prem objects. So you're going to have what, 1-3 replicas? Are you going to charge the users for the archival services? Are you going to charge the users a different cost for, you know, mid-tier, or just for the, you know, cost of using the Scratch file system? And really, you know, what part of that system is part of the TCO? Is it the whole thing from end to end? Or is it just really the expensive part with people putting hands on keyboards, or, you know, having to refresh a file system or something like that? Which is how we ended up with this concept of logical quotas, rather than having just a quota per storage resource or a quota per per user per storage resource. So we're tracking how much data the users are using across the entire system for that cost, not necessarily just the data at rest on one particular piece of technology for that matter. And then, as Pete was saying, when we get these public clouds involved, and people have just been cramming all of their data in there, and then how are we going to manage charging them for that cost of retrieving the data in order to perform the analytics, or running the analytics where the data is at rest within the cloud itself? Are we going to be responsible for those costs too? I mean, that's where the difficulty has always been in getting people to sit around a table and make those decisions, because no one really knows. I mean, I believe we've run into the same issue, at UNC Chapel Hill and Research Computing, where they have, supercomputers and storage, but they have no idea how to charge a particular grant for usage of that particular compute. So it's always been kind of like, well, we'll figure it out. I don't think anyone's actually figured it out yet.
And that's, again, a very valuable input, Jason. And I think a lot of the, I mean, it might not just be a US thing, but a lot of the US universities, when they have a HPC center or a central IT running a service, the way they are designed is they cannot charge a federal grant. So our accounting systems itself are not built to internally use our own money. Like, you could say, I want to do this. So fortunately, at the University of Arizona, they've been pretty creative, where they you can buy in nodes or add something, but now you're sort of paying for infrastructure end to end. It's not like a monthly charge, and so we have some of the storage pieces where you could, but then they've stopped it and they're going to revisit that pretty soon. But I think all campuses struggle with how do you charge back. So you have researchers with sort of money, in their hands, but we're like, nope, we don't know how to take it. But they need the resources, and then they end up doing things that may not be optimal for the project per se. The other part that, Jason, you highlighted is the logical quotas and quotas per directory, which I think is something that's extremely exciting for us in Cyverse, because we've struggled with this of when do you stop, or how do you tell some project what are they utilizing. And in our case, there's a notion of, not notion, but there is your equivalent of home directory, and then there's a project directory and you can be part of multiple projects. And the nature of iRODS being what it is, which we like sort of multiple owners. And so which owner is the real owner, and how do we then associate this cost to that particular project sponsor, if you may. But sort of having that directory structure and saying anything in this directory, Jason's going to pay for. And then that makes life a little bit less complicated, because there's enough turnover of people in projects that they come and go. And when you have large multi-institutional projects, if we are going to keep messing with it, as in who do you send the invoice and then you slice and dice it, it's not worth the revenue that we are talking of. So that definitely is a challenge. So that's a very good capability of iRODS that I feel will make life simpler for many researchers or service providers.
Yeah, and I think if we look at, like Strides and a lot of these other, cloud initiatives, it's going to be, I think this is going to be an increasingly important problem, because there's like a whole layer of software that is missing in order to perform these kinds of operations. Because sooner or later, the Googles and the Amazons and the Azures are going to start, asking people to start paying for all of this machinery that they've built, in the amorphous sky. And I don't know that anyone's going to know how to do that when we get there.
And it's interesting you bring that up, and I hope there is no one from Box. Well, you're headed to Google, but we'll make fun of Google regardless. All of us, at least a lot of the campuses were completely drunk on quote unquote unlimited storage. So everybody in our campus, literally like petabytes of data has been sent into these quote unquote free capabilities. And as we all know, there is no free lunch. And from last year, the university started getting a bill or a heads up on that you will be receiving a bill in a year, which will be this much. And that's like literally lit fire in our campus, where people are now trying to understand how are they going to deal with it. And it's not trivially easy to move, hundreds of terabytes that these researchers have been able to send to the next. And earlier, we were very fortunate when the storage was in-house, that there was a human being institutionally that was responsible for moving it to the next generation of storage or whatever that was. Or if you didn't have funding and something had to be retired or removed or phased out, there's a human being you could talk and call and work with. Now there's no such thing. So the researchers are starting to freak out. It's like, what will I do and who will help me? And so all of these are like real considerations when you move some of these things without a plan or an understanding of how to deal with it. So just a feedback on that. I don't know, Pete, if you had something to add to that.
I was just mention that I think John Constable's mentioned something that ties directly into what you're saying here. There's a question that's come through asking about cloud credits and funding. Is this US specific, and how does that impact?
Yeah, so I think even Jason can speak to it. So NIH has something it calls STRIDES, and it broadly comes under their data commons effort, where in your grant you can put money for, let's say $10,000 to do some computation and storage in Amazon or Google, and I think now Azure. And then they have a company that is a layer in between you and the cloud provider, and that company can bill the university accounts. So I am not giving a credit card, or not my department, which currently is how we operate when we want to use Amazon. It is something that just comes from, you know, that company dealing with an invoice for you, and then they send the invoice to the university, which pays it. So there's no credit card involved. And then that company also helps you to sort of put some checks and balances around your spend limits so that you don't wake up completely bankrupt one morning. And there is some cost savings because they subsidize it by a few percentage, but it's not super significant. So that's NIH side of the fence. NSF has something called Cloud Bank, which has similar approaches, but neither of them give you like cash upfront. You're supposed to write that into your proposal, and when you get funded, you can send that money over to the bank or Cloud Bank or other places. So that sort of is in the US, that what I am aware of, and that's how it's operated. Jason, you also swim in that world, so I don't know if you have any input.
No, but I think you covered that nicely. I'm just sitting here wondering, like, is there some cloud agnostic layer where we can provide some mediation between all of these activities, and in order to track this by identity? Because I was as you were talking, I was thinking it's largely an identity problem. Alice, our scientist, is moving data to a cloud somewhere and running some compute. How much was all of that? And can we keep track of that somehow, with an additional layer of indirection, if you will?
There is a sort of standard approaches which may or may not be relevant here, of course. So we've just been investigating opportunities for various products to keep tabs on our spend across multiple clouds, across the big ones anyway, to provide all the data as a single pane of glass. And one of the early steps you need to take on that is to consider how you tag your projects. So the approach quite often taken is this project will have this particular account association and this utilization, and then they'll get the bill to the project. And that avoids us having to deal with whether it's Bob, Dave, or Tim. It's whoever's responsible for that project, and they can then manage it. That's then their responsibility. The granularity, you're quite right, becomes a bit more of a challenge if you need to get into the blood and guts of things. But that could be something that actually iRODS could be very well geared up for, because the metadata is already there. You've got the structures. perhaps aligning that with the tagging so that when you do, for example, have project number 27 or brain eye or whatever it may be, it's going to be into this bucket. Therefore, any costs associated with that product will be tagged appropriately, linked to that particular, maybe Google or to AWS or Azure, other clouds exist account. And then it will hopefully lines up when your finance get the bill. It's got the project on it. You kind of go, give that to Bob. That's Bob's problem. Maybe that's a way to do it once we've considered how we line up our costs. But I agree, it's not trivial, and aligning with costs and expenditure is not something that universities are very good at, if I'm honest, particularly for recharging. We're not geared up for that. We're geared up for money comes in for a project, for a grant or something. That'll go to a PI for X number of years, and then they get to spend it within the remits of the rules. So recharging is something that's not done very much. We've been getting into this more frequently over the past few years. HPC in Europe have been getting used to the idea of providing a service that you then pay the money back for. So the charging on cost per CPU hour is fairly common. We've got a cost for the different storage types we have, and we have a cost for the service we run on top of it. So that means I can take into account, well, I'm using Lustre for this, so I'm using iRODS for this, or we're using NFS for this. So we've got to charge back on a per terabyte basis over the lifespan. But again, we can break that down to a per hour cost if we need to. And that allows us to have a rough apples to apples kind of comparison. It's not perfect. I think the thing that we're really not quite experienced on our side yet, something we're learning ourselves, is how much extra time or effort does it take to integrate with third-party systems? Mm-hmm. How much more time does it take you saw John's talk on technical deficit earlier, how much more or less time will it take us to run a service against an AWS S3 bucket or a Google bucket or similar? And that's not clear to me at the moment.
So Pete, maybe I can share some of the experiences we have. In our case, if a project wants to collaborate with us and is outside the scope of our regular NSF, which is sort of our primary funder, but we have others as well, we typically have them purchase their quote unquote storage node, if you may, with whatever is the capacity, and gets added into our infrastructure. It's still talking to the same catalog server and everything else. And then the cost of that is borne by that project. And then it sort of fits into the same maintenance umbrella. And then we charge an annual fee of human time of making sure that the OS upgrades or iRODS upgrades and stuff happen. And that has been pretty successful for us. Like in some projects, in our case, we make a replica of data into TAC, our partner in the project. But some groups, they only have funding for one copy, so there is no second copy for it. And the beauty of iRODS allows us to make sure that this resource server is not making a second copy. And so that has been one way of dealing with it. And then we have people who just come in one by one and say, I have a project and this is what I need to store. And then we're like, okay, it's $100 a year a terabyte for a single copy. And then we give it to them. And then the hard part is a lot of the smaller projects have a lot more questions of how to use. And since we have these fancy rules that will trigger something and they'll make a mistake. And so that cost is something that, even though we call it under data management, is such a variable cost. And as you get many, many small projects that want to pay for it, we almost have to now rethink what we consider infrastructure cost and project support cost, where you're now asking for support above and beyond the tier. So we are trying to also separate that. And then the last and this is sort of our vision going forward, is how do we integrate sort of the S3 API based things that different people are bringing in, whether it's Jetstream 2, which is one of our projects that we are involved with, led by Indiana, where there will be a few petabytes of data that is under Ceph. And if a project is using it, can that be attached through our iRODS and made easier for them to do what they're doing? Now for that, we would love for them to bring their own credentials of here's the key and secret, and then we attach that into our iRODS, and then everything that they do is going to that location. It's managed at that location, whether it's Amazon or Jetstream 2. We are not responsible for sort of the physical infrastructure or the networking cost. They all go to whoever brought in those credentials. Now, this does make things challenging for us from a security standpoint. We now have a key and secret that if it leaks, it could create a lot more havoc. But we don't have a good technical solution for it, but this is on our roadmap for the next 6 months as we upgrade our iRODS and bring in more S3 over time. And I'm going to see a lot of that in our biomedical sort of HIPAA and PHI work in Cyber's Health, where we will be relying a lot more on S3 because the whole infrastructure lives in Amazon Gov, and EBS is prohibitively expensive for some of those projects. And so what we are looking at is making iRODS a caching layer that is smart enough where we are only using the catalog server for, we are avoiding all the API calls to Amazon per se. All the inquiries of, size and file and sharing and all of that is happening very much within the catalog server. And S3 is only harassed when we really need to. And the local caching policy avoids if the whole lab is teaching a workshop and 100 people are going to request exactly that same BAM file and everything else that goes with it. The caching will prevent the PI from incurring costs that when they teach a workshop with 100 people gets pretty expensive very quickly because you're now starting to get that over and over again. And most of those labs don't know how to leverage, content delivery networks or anything else. And so the more we can make it easy for them to take those resources, connect it to our iRODS, and be able to do that would be helpful. And I'll end this by like a little story from last year, where one of my colleagues who keeps his data in S3, and as the COVID shutdown was happening for our campus and we were all supposed to only work from home, he told his lab that they should run the sync command in AWS and make sure all their archives that they have, which they keep local, is synced. And the lab dutifully did that. And then he got a $5,000 bill up because they had many, many tiny DICOM files, and it was millions of files that were being checked in it, being checked. And he did not have any money after that because that was their 3-year budget for storage. So I mean, it was he called up out of like complete fear. Is like, I don't know what to do now. So these are the things where I feel researchers get caught, and if there's a way we can do better, it would be great. So any other thoughts, Jason and Pete, before we open it up to the audience?
I can comment on what you just said. We actually implemented policy at a Public Health England that implements something quite similar to that, where they have a centralized object store. And in 3 individual locations, we set up cache resources there. And, through a combination of policy and some resource hierarchy trickery, we have things weighted to check the cache first locally based on IP range. And then from there, if not, reach out and try to fetch the data from the S3 distributed storage system there by, I think it was Cloudian. And so, I think that is going to become an increasingly interesting pattern to the community as we deal with these issues.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, Jason. It's not one shot. I mean, on the one hand, we were engaging with a company to bring in cross-site showback charging. We know what the bills are going to be over time. We set thresholds, so you don't find, actually, I've spent all my money. You get the alert before that happens. You can put some guardrails on, stop stuff before it happens. And that, I think, is a common approach for a lot of organizations that are moving into cloud to try and add that safety net. I think that's an essential part of the governance. In terms of iRODS, the caching, you're absolutely on the money. Doing the compute where the data is most effectively located has long been the most common sense approach to any form of compute model anyway. Having to move your stuff across the planet is insane when you started to talk about terabytes of data. The IOPS will kill you and the egress will murder you. Aligning things with projects, we can make it hard, but I think the part that I'm going to home in on is what's the customer want, because that's where they're going to spend their money. Whoever offers them what they want, right? If it's easier for me to put in S3, I'll pay double the amount, right? That's what they're saying. You're making it easy for me to, here, take my money. So how do we provide a service that is transparent? It's not going to be perfect, we understand that. How do you create a transparent service? I think it's coming up with the models that people want to use. And then underneath it, as you said quite rightly, the storage is whatever the storage is. What's the associated cost for that? Because it is, because you know what the cost is to run the service, right? Once you've got it set up, that's pretty much your investment sorted. We heard a lot about that earlier, actually, on the presentation. My first year in iRODS is probably going to be the heaviest lifting year for setting it up, right? Getting it right is the hard bit. So once you've got the project moving, keeping it transparent is going to be obviously key. But we can make it hard or we can make it easy. And it's up to us what sort of services we want to provide. And that's going to be a reflection of what the customers need, I think.
No, very good point, Pete. And the only thing I'll add is what catches us off guard very often, at least in Cybers, is the naive users that are trying to do things, and because we make it easy for them to do certain things and they don't realize that they're doing something that's borderline denial of service or possibly straight up denial of service attack on our infrastructure. And since there's no chargeback or guardrails, that our guardrail is poor Tony sending a polite email saying, "You're doing bad things to us, please stop." "Oh, you're still not stopping. Really, please stop. I will ban your IP." "Oh, you haven't done anything. I am banning your IP now." And so at which point you don't know how many people you're impacting, but that's sort of our guardrail. Mm-hmm. And I feel bad for the users also, because they're just happy that they can do something that they couldn't do before, but they've never really been able to do that. So or sometimes just a straight up misconfiguration on their end, and it's taking us down. So
this is where governance becomes key, isn't it? If you allow, if we say we support everything, then we have to support everything, and it's our fault when it goes wrong. If we provide best practice guidance, we provide governance, and we provide the tools, then we're in a stronger position to lead. Otherwise, we're kind of being led, and quite often technology around us can move faster than we can, or certainly the institutions that we may be a part of have to align themselves with a changing environment, and that's not necessarily going to happen overnight. So getting the guardrail set up, you're right, is non-trivial. It's a significant body of work. We're going through that ourselves. But I think we don't have a choice. We're going to have to adapt or die, because people are very happy with the tools out there. They're very happy to use them. They're very happy to say, "Here's 50 pence in the meter. Where's my web service?" There it is. When I stop paying the bill, it goes off. And putting guardrails on and making people responsible for the projects is key, because when the project's running, whoever the project lead is, they're responsible for the spend. They get to tell their users the service has gone offline because they didn't pay the bill. I don't think that the system should be taking that on themselves. And there's a risk that in IT, we often take too much upon ourselves. It's not my responsibility. You spent all the money on number 27 black. It's up to you to manage your spend and predict. We're here to help and provide the tools, the feedback, and the infrastructure. And the institute needs to have the governance to back that up. But it's not going to happen overnight. It is a challenging environment to build.
I think, Pete, this also lines up with what Raja was talking about, observability. So now, as if we can almost have projects where, as an iRODS user, you are getting a monthly invoice. I'm just making this up, and it still says, free, paid for by Pete and John. Still £0. That's still better than never getting an invoice and then one day hearing about it. So we're trying to also change the mindset for our users, saying you've used X dollars worth, which would be equivalent of Amazon, and you're not paying anything for it, or here it is being subsidized for you in some way institutionally, because NSF is paying the bucks for you. So some way so that people realize that this is not free, there's something behind it. And so eventually they're prepared because they understand commercial cloud, but for some of what we do institutionally, it's hard to sell it because people equate that to their free Google Drive or Google Photos. Thankfully, Google, I shouldn't say thankfully, but yes, they're charging for the photos starting very soon, or they already may have. So I'm glad to sort of see that mindset change, because that was going against us, because they're like, if Google can give it for free, who are you to like tell us that save money and pay for storage? Storage is plenty and free. Google will take care of me. So I'm hoping that the tide is changing now. So should we open it up to the audience for questions? Carol, you're the boss man, or I don't know, Don.
I was just about to say that I've granted you some more buttons, so I think you can call on people if their hands are up. You might be able to see.
Okay, let me see. Okay.
And then there are a couple questions that are in Slack and have been copied here.
Okay, let me see. Okay, I see one hand up, and that is from Jaron. And I can let you talk. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Raj. Thank you. So I think we are losing some of the users that we have, our main users. That I always find that interesting, right? So we are used to dealing directly with researchers and research projects. But when it comes to RDM, of course, there are more stakeholders there, and mainly the institutions themselves, like the universities, right? When I talk to certain researchers, then we have researchers that actually opt for having a set of hard disks lying on a bookshelf somewhere, and that's their means of doing RDM. And of course, it's totally unacceptable to the institution themselves. So I think it's a bit easy to just lay the burden only with researchers or project managers or something like that. I think since the data is owned by the universities also have a responsibility to make sure that the data is handled correctly according to some kind of policy that they've stated. And I think the real key lies into empowering the end users, so the researchers and the research groups, into making the right decisions. And I really like the example in our neighborhood that Utrecht, for instance, has. They have very clear pages by answering a couple of questions where you are actually led to the right storage solution. So maybe Ton can elaborate a bit on that.
Thank you. Let me see if Don is there, and I can unmute. If you can raise your hand if you would like to. Not seeing.
I don't see.
I don't see.
Ton is not here. That's a shame.
Yeah. So
but basically it's a web
I
page.
see. Okay.
Okay,
go ahead, Don.
Okay. Yes, that's correct. We have like a decision tree approach tool where you can select you just want to do some storage, or do you want to do things more fancier than that. And we attach a policy to it as to what we recommend as a potential storage. So that's basically what we do. I could share that in the chat let me look up the policy.
Yeah, I think it'd be worthwhile for us to gather some of the institutions that do that. And I don't know, Terrell, if there's a page on iRODS where we can just point to some of the community members that have done this kind of work, then it would be a good document to reference for all of us in the future.
Sure. Yeah, we can. We're happy to play the sandbox. So decide what it is we're saying, and then point to things.
Or a working group of sorts, perhaps.
Yeah, like some place where all the policies, pointers to policies, could be consolidated, even if there are 3 or 4 of them to begin with. Because I feel that might help others who are seeking to adopt things like iRODS, knowing, what are the frameworks around the governance and how certain campuses, and I had a chance to see some of the presentations today, and they were really impressive where how they have been put together. And I feel the real value is in understanding some of these rather non-technical but absolutely essential aspects of rolling out these capabilities.
Yeah, definitely. We can do that. We've got links to obviously to presentations past, but we have not taken a stab at characterizing them in any way. So that's something that we could probably take a stronger role in.
Anybody else? It looks like there's one more. Anybody else? Don and you guys, any other comments? Okay, I don't think so.
Yeah, maybe it is tough to it's a fine balance between directing a research to do something and recommending something. Our university does feel that researchers, the PIs, they should have a choice. We should support them within certain policies. For instance, GDPR is an important aspect. They need to go by the GDPR. They can't just store the data just anywhere. But within that limits, that framework of policies, there's a lot of choice for researchers to make their own decisions. And on the other hand, I feel Whitney Raff. I mean, I can sure sympathize with the fact that you felt sorry, research going bankrupt over a wrong decision or something like that. So that it is tough.
Does that speak to the naivety and expectations that people have of various services?
Yes, and we should be extremely clear about the cost that they might burden them. I know that SURF in the Netherlands has devised a model where they use wallets, so that you can extend wallets to researchers, so they can spend credits up to a certain limit. And so you can, within a budget, you can then divide a budget into wallets that can subsequently be spent, also with commercial vendors. So this might be, this granularity way forward, and this might be helpful.
Oh, that was really neat. Don, if you can drop a link to that, because that's a very interesting way.
Yes, it's still rather new what they're doing, but this concept is a wallet is personal. And so if a researcher spins up a VM, for instance, and spends, then it's that the researcher that gets billed for that, that wallet. You need to specify a wallet along with the resource that you're using, and the wallet then is connected to a budget. But it's rather new. The user interfaces are still lacking a bit. You could envision that there is sort of an application that will link a wallet to budgets to cost centers. So we're figuring out what the nice approach would be there. This might be helpful going forward. If you have tools in mind that could do this, then that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I'll be happy to chat with you, because we have been thinking of what is it that we can do to allow our users to quote unquote spend within our infrastructure in a managed way. And obviously I'm not talking of cryptocurrency or anything else to build that wallet, but our campus itself is now exploring sort of a concept of a wallet, which includes everything from the transcripts for the students that are encrypted and kept there, and they also have money that they spend to buy food and other things. So as part of that, giving them computational, here's your resource for running that many hours on the high performance computing system. And so currently that is managed by the principal investigators, where you have a monthly spend. There are no rollover minutes, but that many high priority compute hours on our systems. And so then that also would show up, and this wallet is what the students take around on campus, or so to speak, and then use services that matter to their work, and not have to worry about all the sort of book balancing or they can easily balance their books about how they are investing the resources that the university is providing them. So any other thoughts from anybody else? Any questions, suggestions?
I was thinking about quotas and the problem you had mentioned earlier. And, I mean, there's also an opportunity to say no more, which is not a thing that I think IT people are used to doing. But, we could consider a policy to set an access quota per month or per year or per, budget term for data access, say in that S3 bucket for all those DICOM files. After the third time they got downloaded, we could have just said no from there on out. You're doing something terrible. We have the opportunity to say, okay, if you're going to put your data in the cloud, then your compute is going to have to be in the cloud, and you're not going to be able to access that data outside of a cloud instance where you're going to run your analytics, on an EC2 or what have you. And so
I think that's a great idea, Jason. If we had sort of set of such policies that were templated out, and
yeah,
don't shoot yourself in the foot, or you
Right.
already taken out your left foot, now your right foot's about to go, don't do it, would be helpful.
I mean,
Yeah. How would that change?
I would think it's key that that users then have a way of managing the within boundaries the quota themselves. I mean, typically we would allow users to go without quotas and then go unlimited if you like, and then charge them for it. So as long as within boundaries, that will be a fine approach, because then they feel in control, the researchers, and I think that is important. I do realize that you can't always do that. You have certain limitations on resources, or you need to set boundaries. But if there could be a gentle warning mechanism long before the quota is reached, so that researchers can influence that, that would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm hinting at we're in a situation where the storage that is used is so disparate that the nature of the storage and the location of the storage can also inform how that storage is going to be, accessed and used by those users. So if you are going to be a cloud native, user as compared to an on-prem, off-prem, 3 replicas, super safe, those all have, different policies associated with them, and perhaps different sets of bumpers, I guess is the word we were using earlier, that we can consider knitting into those policies that we don't necessarily consider right now, because the hard part was making all of this storage absolutely transparent and accessible, and now the users can get at all of it. Well, great, but now we need to consider what those next steps are and how the users are going to be hurting themselves with it.
And it doesn't have to be related to actual cost. You could use your accounting mechanism also to drive users in the right direction, if you with a gentle push. I'm all for those kind of approaches.
Yeah, and I think this again goes back to what Raja was saying, right? Like once we have the data of good usage patterns, and if we can recommend, hey, people like you do, also would benefit from this, then it's a very informed decision of how the platform is utilized. Because I think since there's no visibility, sometimes when people are doing things that are not ideal, they end up just doing it because they have no visibility. But if they knew that this was impacting other people or even their own work, the classic for us is people wanting to have more parallel transfer threads, but then they're realizing that 16 threads is not ideal. 4 gives them much more throughput than 16, but 16 is much bigger than 4, so why not? So we have
That-
lost 9 minutes. Anybody else?
I
So
was going to say performance is very interesting. One of the things we've said here is cost for unit space. Performance in cloud is not the same as performance on site. So if it costs you $1 per hour at Google and it costs you $1 per hour at site, but your work's done 3 times faster on site, then you're 3 times cheaper. So the cost per service calculation can be very different based on the performance levels as well. You should quite rightly say with the threads, that has a big difference when you're dealing with wide area networks, you're dealing with security mechanisms between them. So you're absolutely right. That needs to be a part of your TCO and actually how you cost your service. And that comes down to your developers as well. So if you've got developers creating services based on these different environments, the costing isn't just the cost per hour.
yeah, completely agree. Okay, so I would say the action item for us, is there someone else that,
There's one more hand up.
whose hand is that?
Dan Taylor.
Okay, Dan, good. Let me find you, but I don't see Dan.
There he is.
Okay.
Hey, Jason. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Nirav, same.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, I've been working with some of the Strides folks, and obviously Internet 2 does a lot with the intermediaries that hand over the Net Plus program for the cloud. So I'm very interested in that, in those ideas of having multi-cloud controls. So I'd love to follow up with you guys on formulating that to see whether it's whether something that Internet 2 can help out on or get behind and shed some light on some of those back-end systems. Or I remember talking to the Stride, multi-cloud accounting and stuff like that. So you might, whether that would be helpful or not, very interesting.
Dan, that would be, I mean, I would really welcome that conversation, and I feel Internet 2 is very well positioned to maybe even drive some of these conversations to some useful point. And the reason I say that is you guys also understand the sort of NSF and NIH funding vehicle, but the frustration I've had is a single grant has a start and an end date that's pretty well defined, but the researcher's intention of working with that data spans beyond that. And there is no like end by or expire by date or best by this date, and then you just throw it out. So there is no soft landing, or there's no easy transition of some of these things. And this is intellectual capital that cannot be thrown away without consequence. And so whatever is the equivalent of putting it into the deep freeze or glacier type mindset for some of these things, so that you can come back and still be functional when you have the right resources, but not lose your intellectual capital, if you may, that was produced from those projects. And sadly, at least in my case, most of the good work happens when the grant is about to end and is in a no-cost extension. So we are all panicking if we have to rely on a system that's going to turn the lights off just about when we are getting productive with some of these things. So it's a challenging place, and I'm hoping Internet 2 and you guys can bring some of these conversations to light of how do we blend infrastructure that's local cloud and funding agency subsidized.
So I do have one thought on this one. I don't know how this affects America, so this is an open question as well. In Europe, and I never thought I was going to say what I'm about to say, we're lucky to have GDPR because it's forcing people to have data governance, right? GDPR, one of the things, a part of GDPR, which I've still got the Happy Halloween t-shirt with that on it, includes a part of data lifecycle management. You're only allowed to have the data for a period of time to perform the research on that you've agreed to, you signed up to. And a part of that is it goes afterwards. So you may get an extension to that, that's fine, but still then defined. It's still got a lifespan. After that, it's going. I don't care how much you might want it in the future. That was a lifespan.
Depends on
So
the classification of your data, of course.
absolutely, absolutely correct. And in some ways, again, I'm going to say something I didn't think I'd ever say. Being genomics, how much of your DNA is actually personal to you is an ongoing question. So yeah, believe it or not, that is an ongoing question. Nobody wants to be the test case, but I think that's going to drive in our environment what we're allowed to do. And that includes the microscopy work as well. How long can we keep it? And will that force a certain maturity of data governance that we haven't previously had?
I think we have a few minutes left. David, go ahead, sorry.
And also, I'm always surprised about the lack of strategic thinking on this in the sourcing question, right? So for me, it's quite clear that you put your data into a cloud if you actually do your calculations in the cloud, because egress costs are prohibitive. So I think it's for strategic importance for institutions to have a on-prem copy of their assets, right? So you can easily switch between clouds as well. And I'm always surprised by the lack of strategic thinking by researchers. Well, from researchers I can understand it, because it's not the thing they are typically concerned with every day. But also from institutions themselves. I mean, it's pretty cost effective. It should be cost effective for universities, or even at an Internet 2 or a SURF or transnational level to have community storage repositories to do this. So I'm always surprised that we actually spend more money talking about sourcing than actually investing a couple of €100,000 or €1 million, if you like, for a big chunk of storage capacity on-prem.
So I think we have last few minutes left, and I think was it David? I'm going to make sure had some comments. And Jaron, there is a bunch of new NSF projects. I think one of them is called Open Storage Cloud, or and that is dealing with ways where the universities can stand up their own but connect with each other and provide that as a service. I'm hoping that the funding agencies are looking at this. So Dave, please go ahead.
I just wanted to mention complaints that I heard. I come from the storage industry. And so Narav, you mentioned that researchers expect to have their data online for a long time. But even worse, sometimes government agencies get involved. So like the EPSRC says, okay, you got to keep data for 10 years. But that's not funded often. I mean, the idea is, oh yeah, you have to do that. It's like the data hubs, they got started with some funding, but they're moving on now and they're costly. So I think that's just another thing I wanted to throw out there, that having government regulations involved that really aren't funded is also a pretty big problem. And I think we're going to start to see that in the US as well.
Very, very good point. So we are almost approaching the allocated time. I want to thank both Jason and Pete. And Jason, even though you're going to disappear to like a darker side, we expect to see you very frequently on this side to make up for all the dark side work you'll do. So
absolutely.
Well, thank you for everything you've done for the consortium and the community. I cannot think of anybody better for bringing us where we are today. And Pete, thank you for being on this, and all the people who have given us comments. And Dan, I'm hoping Internet 2 can also help us with some of these governance questions. I will wrap this up and let everybody go to the pubs or start drinking early. Well, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.